The rain had finally begun to weaken. Drops still tapped against the wooden windows of the little church, but the storm no longer sounded angry. Inside, most of the congregation had already left. Only a handful of people remained. Elvis was still sitting on the bench near the front, staring at the folded piece of paper Samuel had given him. He had read the words several times. "You shouldn't forget why you sing." They were simple. A child had written them, but somehow they felt heavier than anything a grown man had ever said to him. Samuel sat beside him, swinging his little legs beneath the bench. After several moments, the boy broke the silence. "Do people know you sing?" Elvis smiled. "Some people do." "Are you famous?" Elvis hesitated. "I don't know about famous." Samuel looked at him suspiciously. "My cousin heard you on the radio." Elvis laughed. "Your cousin did?" Samuel nodded. "He said you move around too much." Elvis laughed harder. "Sounds like your cousin," Samuel smiled. Then his expression became serious. "Does your mother like your singing?" The question caught Elvis completely off guard. He looked down. For a few seconds he didn't answer. "She does. Does she come to your shows?" "Sometimes." Samuel nodded. "My grandmother comes when I sing." Elvis looked toward the elderly woman standing near the doorway. "She's proud of you." Samuel smiled. "She says I have a gift." Elvis nodded. "She might be right." Samuel looked at him. "Do you think you have a gift?" Elvis looked toward the piano. "I think I have something." "What?" Elvis searched for the right word. "I don't know yet." Samuel accepted that answer. But then he asked another question. "Why were you crying?" Elvis looked at him. "I wasn't crying." Samuel immediately smiled. "You were." Elvis shook his head. "Rain got in my eyes." Samuel laughed. "Inside the church?" Elvis laughed too. "All right, maybe I was crying." "Why?" The smile faded from Elvis's face. He looked toward the dark windows. "When you grow up, you'll understand." Samuel frowned. "I already understand some things." Elvis turned toward him. "Like what?" The boy thought for a moment. "Like when people sing because they're happy." He paused. "And when they sing because they're hurting." Elvis said nothing. Samuel continued. "I think you were doing the second one." Elvis looked down. The boy was right again. There was something unusual about being understood by someone so young. Perhaps it was because Samuel wasn't trying to analyze him. He wasn't interested in Elvis Presley as a performer. He wasn't interested in records or radio stations. He simply saw a young man who had walked into a church alone on a rainy night. A young man who looked tired. A young man who seemed to be searching for something. The pastor approached them. He had been listening from a distance. "Samuel," he said gently. "Yes, sir?" "Your grandmother is ready to go." Samuel stood. Then he looked at Elvis. "Are you coming back?" Elvis looked around the little church. He didn't know why the question made his chest tighten. "Maybe." Samuel shook his head. "That's not an answer." Elvis smiled. "I'll try." Samuel nodded. "Good." He started walking away. Then he turned around. "Oh, and Elvis?" Elvis froze. It was the first time Samuel had called him by his name. "Yes?" "You sing better when you're not trying to sound important." Elvis stared at him. The pastor closed his eyes, trying not to laugh. Samuel ran toward his grandmother. Elvis shook his head. "That boy," the pastor smiled. "He has a way of seeing things." Elvis looked at him. "Yeah." The pastor sat beside him. For a while neither man spoke. Finally, the pastor said, "You know, most young men who walk through that door want something." Elvis looked confused. "What do you mean?" "They want money, attention, approval, a chance to prove themselves." The pastor looked at the folded paper in Elvis's hand. "But you didn't ask for anything." Elvis slowly folded the paper again. "I just heard the singing." "I know." The pastor leaned back. "That's why I let you stay." Elvis looked at him. The pastor continued, "You listened before you spoke." Those words stayed with Elvis. He had spent much of his young life trying to be heard. Tonight, for the first time, he realized the value of listening. The pastor stood. "You should get home before the roads get worse." Elvis nodded. He walked toward the door, but before leaving, he stopped. He turned around and looked at the piano, then at the empty microphone, then at the wooden benches. He could still hear Samuel's voice in his mind. "You shouldn't forget why you sing." Elvis stepped outside. The rain had almost stopped. He walked toward his car. Then he heard footsteps behind him. Samuel was standing at the church door. His grandmother had allowed him to come outside for one last goodbye. Elvis smiled. "You're supposed to be inside." Samuel shrugged. "I wanted to say goodbye." Elvis nodded. "Goodbye, Samuel." The boys stared at him. "Are you going to be famous?" Elvis smiled. "I don't know." Samuel thought about it. Then he said, "I think you will." Elvis laughed. "Why?" "Because you don't know you're good yet." Elvis's smile slowly disappeared. That sentence followed him all the way to his car. He opened the door. Before getting inside, he looked back. Samuel was still standing in the doorway. Elvis touched the folded paper inside his jacket. Then he drove away. For several miles he said nothing. The windshield wipers moved back and forth. The road stretched endlessly in front of him. But his mind was back inside that church. He could hear the choir. He could hear the piano. He could hear Samuel's tiny voice. And suddenly, Elvis began thinking about his own music differently. Maybe music wasn't supposed to prove that you were special. Maybe it was supposed to remind people that they weren't alone. That thought frightened him, because if it were true, then every song he sang had to mean something. He couldn't simply perform. He had to feel. He had to tell the truth, even if the truth hurt. And that was something he had never been taught. He reached into his jacket and touched the paper again. Then he whispered, "Why I sing." The words sounded strange, but they felt right. Before we go any further, let me ask you something. If an 8-year-old child looked directly at you and told you the truth about yourself, even if that truth hurt, would you listen? Comment yes if you would. And tell us where you're watching from. What city or country are you listening from tonight? If you're enjoying this story, take a second to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and stay with us. Because what happened next wasn't just about Elvis. It was about a promise. And Elvis was about to discover that promises made to children can be harder to break than promises made to adults. The following morning, Elvis woke before sunrise. He had barely slept. The little church kept appearing in his dreams. He remembered the faces, the music, the silence when he entered, and most of all, Samuel. Elvis got dressed and sat on the edge of his bed. He reached into his jacket. The paper was still there. He unfolded it. The handwriting was uneven. The words were simple. But Elvis stared at them as if they contained an answer. He folded the paper again. Then something unexpected happened. He picked up the telephone. He called a friend. "Do you know that little church off the old road?" There was a pause. "Which one?" "The wooden one near the trees." His friend laughed. "What are you talking about?" Elvis smiled. "Never mind." He hung up. But the thought wouldn't leave him. He wanted to go back. Not because he wanted to sing, not because he wanted attention. He wanted to know whether Samuel was there. He wanted to hear that choir again. That afternoon, Elvis drove back toward the church. But when he arrived, something felt different. The building was quiet. No music, no people outside. The door was locked. Elvis stepped out of his car. He walked to the front. He knocked. Nothing. He knocked again. Still nothing. He looked through the window. Empty benches, the piano, the microphone, everything exactly as he remembered it, except Samuel wasn't there. Elvis turned around. Then he noticed something on the ground near the steps. A small envelope. His name was written across it. Elvis. He picked it up. His heart began beating faster. He opened the envelope. Inside was another handwritten message, only one sentence. "Come back Sunday." Elvis stared at it. He smiled. Then his smile slowly faded, because beneath the sentence was something else, a second line, something that made his stomach tighten. "I need your help." Elvis looked toward the empty church. For the first time, he wondered what had happened after he left. Why had Samuel written that? What kind of trouble could an 8-year-old boy possibly be in? And why had he chosen Elvis? Elvis folded the note. He put it carefully inside his pocket. Then he looked toward the church one more time. "Sunday," he whispered. He had no idea what awaited him. He only knew one thing. He was going back. And this time, he wouldn't be walking into that church as a stranger. He would be walking in because an 8-year-old boy had asked him to come. And somewhere inside that little wooden building, a secret was waiting. A secret that would force Elvis to choose between walking away or finally using his voice for something bigger than himself.
The rain had been falling over Memphis for nearly an hour when 20-year-old Elvis Presley turned the wheel of his old car onto a narrow country road. It was 1955. Elvis was still a young man trying to find his place in a world that had no idea what he would become. He had recorded songs. People had begun talking about him. A few teenagers already recognized his face. But he was not yet the Elvis Presley the world would soon know. There were no screaming crowds waiting outside hotels, no flashing cameras, no sold-out arenas, no millions of people watching his every move. That night, he was simply a 20-year-old boy, driving alone through the rain. His jacket was damp. His hair had fallen slightly across his forehead. One hand rested on the steering wheel, while the other tapped quietly against the door. Then he heard something. At first, he thought it was the rain. Then he heard the music again. A voice. Then another. A harmony so powerful that it seemed to rise above the storm. Elvis slowly took his foot off the gas. The sound was coming from a small wooden church hidden behind a row of trees. He had heard gospel music like this before. He had grown up around it. But something about this sound was different. It wasn't polished. It wasn't perfect. It was raw. It was painful. It sounded like people singing because they had something inside them that had to come out. Elvis pulled the car to the side of the road. For several seconds, he simply sat there. Rain slid down the windshield. The church windows glowed warmly in the darkness. He could see shadows moving inside. He knew he was a stranger. And in 1955, walking uninvited into a small black church in the South was not something a young white man could do without people noticing. Elvis knew that. He almost drove away. But then the singers reached the chorus. His fingers tightened around the steering wheel. He whispered to himself, "Just for a minute." He stepped out of the car. The rain immediately soaked the shoulders of his jacket. He walked toward the church. Every step seemed louder than the last. When he reached the door, he stopped. His hand hovered over the handle. Inside, the singing continued. Elvis took a breath. Then he opened the door. The music stopped. Completely. Not slowly. Not gradually. 1 second, the church was alive with voices. The next, there was nothing. Dozens of eyes turned toward him. Elvis stood in the doorway, water dripping from his hair. For a moment, nobody moved. He could feel every eye in the room. An elderly man near the front slowly lowered his hymnal. A woman whispered something to the person beside her. 2 teenagers in the back stared openly. Elvis suddenly felt very young, much younger than 20. He removed his hat and held it against his chest. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. Nobody answered. Elvis swallowed. "I heard the singing from the road." Still nothing. "I didn't mean to interrupt." A few seconds passed. Then the pastor, a tall older man with silver hair, stood from his chair. He looked carefully at Elvis. "What brings you here, young man?" Elvis glanced toward the congregation. "I don't really know." The pastor raised an eyebrow. Elvis gave a nervous half-smile. "I heard the music." The pastor studied him for another moment. Then he looked toward the empty bench near the back. "You can listen." Elvis nodded. "Thank you." He walked inside. The door closed behind him, and nobody knew that this simple decision would become one of the most unforgettable nights of his young life. Elvis sat alone near the back. He kept his eyes lowered. He didn't try to draw attention to himself. He didn't tell anyone who he was. He didn't mention the songs he had recorded. He didn't mention the small amount of fame beginning to follow him. For the first time that night, he simply listened. The choir started again. A woman near the piano began playing softly. The voices rose. Elvis closed his eyes. His expression changed. The music seemed to reach somewhere inside him that words couldn't touch. He thought about Tupelo, about his childhood, about his mother, about the little house where he had grown up, about the dreams that had once seemed impossible. He thought about how strange his life had become. Just a few years earlier, he had been an unknown young man, trying to make something of himself. Now people were beginning to recognize him, but despite all of that, there were nights when he still felt completely lost, and this church made him feel something he hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Across the room, an 8-year-old boy was watching him. His name was Samuel. Samuel had been sitting beside his grandmother. He was small for his age, with neatly combed hair and serious eyes. Unlike everyone else, he wasn't staring at Elvis because Elvis was a stranger. He was staring because he was curious. He noticed the way Elvis listened, the way his fingers moved slightly whenever the piano changed chords, the way his eyes became wet during the song. Samuel leaned toward his grandmother. "Grandma." She looked down. "What? Why is that man crying?" His grandmother glanced toward Elvis. "Don't bother him." "But he's crying." "Samuel." The boy looked back at Elvis. "He looks sad." His grandmother gently touched his shoulder. "Listen to the music." Samuel obeyed. For perhaps another 20 minutes, the service continued. Then the pastor stepped forward. He looked over the congregation. "Before we close tonight, I'd like one of our youngest voices to come forward." Samuel immediately froze. His grandmother smiled. "Go on." "No." "Samuel." "I don't want to." The pastor smiled. "Come here, son." The little boy slowly stood. He walked toward the microphone. His shoes made tiny sounds against the wooden floor. Elvis watched him. Samuel reached the microphone. His hands were trembling. The pianist began playing. Samuel took a breath. Then he sang. The first note was soft, almost fragile, but the second note filled the entire room. Elvis's eyes opened wider. Samuel's voice was far more powerful than anyone expected from such a small child. The congregation joined in. The church seemed to shake with the sound. Elvis leaned forward. He had heard talented singers before, but Samuel wasn't simply singing. He was feeling every word. And somehow, the little boy's voice carried a sadness that seemed much older than 8 years. Elvis wiped his eye. Samuel noticed. He kept singing. When the song ended, everyone applauded. Samuel stepped away from the microphone. Then something unexpected happened. Instead of returning to his seat, Samuel turned around. He looked directly at Elvis. The entire congregation followed his gaze. Elvis looked behind himself, as if wondering whether Samuel was looking at someone else. Samuel pointed at him. "You!" Elvis blinked. "Me?" Samuel nodded. "Come sing." The room became completely silent. Someone near the front whispered, "Samuel." But the boy didn't move. Elvis slowly shook his head. "No, son." "Why?" Elvis smiled nervously. "Because this is your church." Samuel frowned. "So?" A few people laughed softly. Elvis looked toward the pastor. The pastor said nothing. He simply watched. Samuel took one step toward Elvis. "You came here because you like the singing." Elvis nodded. "Yes." "Then sing." The laughter disappeared. Elvis looked down at his hands. There was something strangely disarming about the boy. An 8-year-old wasn't thinking about race. He wasn't thinking about fame. He wasn't thinking about what other people might say. He was thinking about music, and somehow that made Elvis feel ashamed of every excuse he had been preparing. He stood. The room watched. Elvis walked slowly toward the microphone. He stopped beside Samuel. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then Samuel whispered, "Don't be scared." Elvis almost laughed. "I'm not scared." Samuel looked at him seriously. "Yes, you are." The congregation laughed again. Even Elvis couldn't help smiling. He looked at the pastor. The pastor finally nodded. "Sing what you know." Elvis turned toward the piano. The pianist waited. Elvis took a breath. Then he began. His voice was young. Not the polished voice the world would one day recognize. Not the legendary voice from decades of recordings. Just a young man's voice. But there was emotion in it. Pain, longing, hope. The church became still. Nobody whispered. Nobody moved. Even the rain outside seemed distant. Samuel stood beside him, listening. Elvis continued, and as he sang, something inside him began to break open. He wasn't performing. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was remembering. His mother. His childhood. The feeling of being poor. The feeling of wanting something that nobody else believed he could have. When he finished, there was silence. For several seconds, nobody applauded. Elvis looked up. He thought perhaps he had made a mistake. Then an elderly woman in the front row began clapping. Slowly. Once, twice. Then everyone joined her. The applause filled the wooden church. Elvis lowered his head. Samuel smiled. And then the little boy walked over and took Elvis's hand. Elvis looked down. Samuel squeezed his fingers. "You really were sad." Elvis's smile disappeared. "What?" "When you were singing." Elvis looked at the child. Samuel continued quietly. "You sounded like somebody who misses something." Those words struck Elvis harder than any applause could have. He stared at the boy. For the first time that evening, he didn't know what to say. Because Samuel was right. There was something he missed, something he couldn't explain, something he carried everywhere. Elvis slowly sat down beside him. Outside, the rain continued to fall. Inside, the little church had become quiet again. But nobody realized that Samuel had just said something that Elvis would remember long after this night was over. And before we continue, I want to ask you something. If you were sitting inside that church in 1955 and a young Elvis Presley suddenly walked through the door, would you welcome him or would you be suspicious of him? Write welcome or suspicious in the comments. And tell me where you're watching this story from, your city or your country. If this story has already pulled you into that rainy night, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe, and stay with us. Because Samuel had no idea that his next question was going to uncover a part of Elvis Presley that almost nobody in that room knew existed. The pastor eventually announced that the service was over. People began gathering their coats. Some still glanced toward Elvis. Others approached him cautiously. A woman thanked him for singing. An older man simply nodded. But Samuel stayed beside him. Elvis noticed, "You don't have to stay." Samuel shrugged. "I want to." "Why?" The boy thought for a moment. "Because you look lonely." Elvis laughed softly. "I'm not lonely." Samuel looked at the empty church around them. "Yes, you are." Elvis stopped smiling. The boy's honesty was almost painful. He looked toward the piano, then toward the rain-covered windows. "Maybe, sometimes." Samuel nodded as if that answer made perfect sense. Then he reached into his pocket. He pulled out a tiny folded piece of paper. Elvis looked at it. "What's that?" Samuel held it out. "I wrote something." Elvis took the paper. He unfolded it. There were only a few words written in a child's uneven handwriting. Elvis read them. His face changed. He read them again. Then he looked at Samuel. "What does this mean?" Samuel answered simply. "You shouldn't forget why you sing." Elvis stared at him. Outside, thunder rolled across the Tennessee sky. And for the first time that night, Elvis realized something. He had entered this church thinking he was only stopping to listen to music. But perhaps the music had been waiting for him. And perhaps this little boy had been waiting too. Elvis folded the paper carefully. He placed it inside his jacket. He would keep it. At least for now. Neither of them knew that the next few minutes would change the way Elvis looked at his own voice, and neither knew that when Elvis finally walked back through that church door, he would not be leaving as the same young man who had entered it. The rain was still falling. The road was still dark. But somewhere inside that 20-year-old singer, something had begun to awaken. Something he would carry with him long after the little wooden church disappeared behind the trees.
Sunday arrived slowly. For Elvis, it felt like the longest Sunday of his life. All morning, he kept thinking about the envelope. "Come back Sunday." And beneath it, "I need your help." He had no idea what Samuel meant. An 8-year-old boy shouldn't have been sending mysterious messages to a grown man. But something about the note had bothered Elvis all week. It wasn't the handwriting. It wasn't even the words. It was the feeling behind them. Samuel hadn't sounded frightened. He had sounded determined. By late afternoon, Elvis finally got into his car. The sky over Tennessee was turning orange as the sun began to disappear. He drove the same road he had traveled several nights earlier. The same trees, the same wooden fence, the same narrow path. And finally, the little church appeared. But this time, something was different. There were cars everywhere. People stood outside. Some were talking quietly, others looked worried. Elvis slowed the car. He immediately knew something was wrong. He parked near the church and stepped out. A woman saw him and froze. She recognized him. Another person whispered his name. But nobody approached him. Elvis walked toward the entrance. Before he could open the door, he heard a voice behind him. "You're back!" Elvis turned. Samuel's grandmother was standing there. She looked tired. Her face carried an expression Elvis hadn't seen the previous night. Fear. Elvis removed his hat. "Is Samuel all right?" The woman looked toward the church, then back at him. "He's inside." "What's wrong?" She hesitated. "His father hasn't come home." Elvis's expression changed. "What happened?" "We don't know." She lowered her voice. "He was supposed to come back 2 nights ago." Elvis looked toward the church. "Did you call the police?" The woman nodded. "They're looking." Elvis didn't know what to say. He had expected a child's problem, a broken toy, a school issue, something small. Not this. Then Samuel appeared in the doorway. The boy looked different. He wasn't smiling. His shoulders were lowered. His eyes looked tired. When he saw Elvis, he immediately walked toward him. "You came." Elvis knelt down. "I said I would." Samuel stared at him. "My dad is missing." Elvis nodded. "I heard." Samuel looked down. "He always comes home." Elvis gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "We'll figure it out." Samuel looked into his eyes. "Can you help?" Elvis hesitated. "I'll do what I can." Samuel nodded. Then he reached into his pocket. He pulled out another piece of paper. Elvis took it. There was a rough drawing on it, a road, a bridge, a small building, and an old truck. "What is this?" Elvis asked. Samuel pointed to the drawing. "My dad works near the river." Elvis studied it. "Where?" Samuel pointed again. "At the old warehouse." Elvis looked at the grandmother. She nodded. "He sometimes worked late there." "Did anyone check it?" "We don't know where exactly he went." Elvis looked back at Samuel. "Did he say anything before he disappeared?" Samuel thought. "He told me he had to deliver something." "What?" "I don't know." Elvis stood. "Then we'll start there." The grandmother immediately shook her head. "No." Elvis looked at her. "Why?" "It's getting dark." "I understand. And you don't know this area." Elvis glanced toward the road. "I can drive." She looked at him carefully. Perhaps she was wondering why a young white singer she barely knew was willing to get involved in something that wasn't his problem. Elvis understood the question without hearing it. "I came here because I heard people singing." He looked toward Samuel. "Now I can't just leave." The grandmother's eyes softened. For a moment she said nothing. Then she nodded. "Be careful." Elvis turned to Samuel. "You stay here." Samuel shook his head. "No, Samuel. I know where the warehouse is." "You can't come." "I can show you." Elvis sighed. The boy looked at him with the same stubborn expression he had shown the night before. Finally, Elvis crouched down. "You stay in the car." Samuel nodded. "Okay." Elvis pointed toward him. "And you don't move unless I tell you." "I won't." "Promise?" "I promise." They left. The drive toward the river was quiet. Samuel sat beside Elvis, staring through the window. The last light of day disappeared behind the trees. Elvis kept both hands on the steering wheel. Finally, Samuel spoke. "My dad doesn't like your music." Elvis smiled. "That's all right." "He says it's too wild." Elvis laughed. "A lot of people say that." Samuel looked at him. "But I like it." Elvis smiled. "Thank you." Then Samuel added, "But I like your singing in church better." Elvis laughed again. "You might be the only person who thinks that." Samuel smiled. The car continued down the road. Then the warehouse appeared. It was an old, wooden structure near the river. The place looked abandoned. Elvis parked several yards away. He turned off the engine. "Stay here." Samuel nodded. Elvis stepped out. The air smelled of wet earth and the river. He approached the warehouse. The door was partially open. Elvis pushed it gently. It creaked. Inside, the building was dark. He waited for his eyes to adjust. There were boxes everywhere, old tools, pieces of wood, a broken chair. Then he noticed something on the floor, a hat. Elvis picked it up. "Samuel." The boy had already climbed out of the car. He ran toward Elvis. "Is that my dad's?" Elvis looked at him. "Do you recognize it?" Samuel nodded. "That's his." The boy grabbed the hat. He held it against his chest. His eyes filled with tears. Elvis crouched beside him. "We're going to find him." Then Elvis heard something, a sound from deeper inside the warehouse, a faint metallic noise. Clink! He immediately stood. "Stay behind me." They moved slowly. Another sound. Clink. Elvis followed it toward the back. There was a narrow hallway. At the end was a small storage room. The door was closed. Elvis reached for the handle. He stopped. Someone was breathing inside. He looked at Samuel. "Stay here." Then he opened the door. The room was empty. Almost. There was a small wooden box on the floor. Elvis opened it. Inside was a bundle of papers, receipts, letters, and something else, a photograph. Samuel's father was standing beside another man. Elvis looked at the photograph. He didn't recognize the other man, but something about him looked familiar. Then Samuel stepped closer. "That's Mr. Carter." "Who is he?" "He works at the warehouse." Elvis looked at the photograph again. Then he noticed a date written on the back, 2 days earlier. He suddenly heard footsteps outside. Elvis froze. Samuel grabbed his hand. Someone was walking toward the warehouse, slowly. Heavy footsteps. Elvis whispered, "Don't move." The footsteps stopped. Then the warehouse doors slammed shut. Samuel's eyes widened. Elvis looked toward the entrance. The room suddenly felt much smaller. Someone was inside, and they knew Elvis was there. Before we continue, I want to ask you something. If you were Elvis in that moment, trapped inside an old warehouse with an 8-year-old child and someone outside who might be dangerous, would you stay and find the missing father, or would you get the child out immediately? Comment, "Stay" or "Leave." And don't forget to tell us where you're watching from. City, state, or country. I'd love to know how far this story has traveled. If you're enjoying the story, hit the like button, subscribe, and stay until the end. Because what Elvis found inside that warehouse was only the beginning. Elvis slowly moved toward the door. He motioned for Samuel to stay behind the boxes. The boy nodded. Elvis reached for a piece of broken wood lying on the floor. He wasn't looking for a fight. He simply wanted something to protect the child with. The footsteps came closer. One step, then another. Then silence. Elvis held his breath. The door opened. A man stepped inside. Elvis immediately recognized him. It was the man from the photograph, Mr. Carter. He looked at Elvis, then at Samuel. His face changed. "You shouldn't be here." Elvis lowered the piece of wood. "We're looking for Samuel's father." Carter's jaw tightened. "You need to leave." Where is he? Carter didn't answer. Samuel stepped out from behind the boxes. Where's my dad? Carter looked at the boy. His expression softened, but only for a moment. Go home, Samuel. Where is my father? Carter looked away. Elvis stepped closer. You need to tell us. Carter's eyes hardened. You don't understand what you're getting involved in. Then explain it. The man stared at Elvis. You think because people know your name, you can walk into any place and fix everything? Elvis didn't respond. Carter continued, This isn't a song. The words hit Elvis strangely, because he had been thinking the same thing. This wasn't music. This wasn't a stage. There was no microphone, no applause, no audience, just a frightened child and a missing father. Elvis looked at Samuel, then back at Carter. No, he said quietly. It's not. He stepped forward. But he's still a child. Carter looked down. For several seconds the man's expression changed. Then he finally spoke. Samuel's father found something. What? Evidence. Evidence of what? Carter looked toward the door, then lowered his voice. Someone has been stealing money from the workers. Elvis frowned. And Samuel's father found out? Carter nodded. He was going to report it. To who? The authorities. Elvis looked at the photograph. Who is behind it? Carter didn't answer. Then a loud sound came from outside. A car engine. Carter's face went pale. They're back. Who? Carter looked at Elvis. You need to take Samuel and leave. Where is his father? Carter hesitated. Then he whispered, He's alive. Samuel gasped. Where? Carter pointed toward the river. An old cabin. Elvis immediately turned toward the door. Let's go. Carter grabbed his arm. No. Elvis looked at him. You don't understand. Carter shook his head. If they see you, they'll know someone is helping him. Elvis looked toward Samuel. The boy was terrified. Then Elvis remembered the folded piece of paper in his pocket. You shouldn't forget why you sing. He suddenly understood what Samuel had been teaching him. Having a voice wasn't about being heard by thousands. Sometimes it meant speaking when silence was easier. Elvis looked directly at Carter. Then they'll know. Carter stared at him. Elvis took Samuel's hand. We're bringing his father home. Outside, the car engine grew louder. The warehouse door began to shake. Someone was coming. Elvis looked at Samuel. The boy squeezed his hand. And for the first time that night, Elvis wasn't thinking about fame. He wasn't thinking about music. He wasn't even thinking about himself. He was thinking about one promise. The promise he had made to an 8-year-old boy. I'll do what I can. And now he was about to find out exactly how far those words would take him. The warehouse door shook again. Samuel grabbed Elvis's hand. The sound of the approaching car made everyone inside freeze. Carter whispered, There isn't much time. Elvis looked at him. Where's the cabin? Carter pointed toward the river. About half a mile east. Follow the old fence. Elvis nodded. Then he looked at Samuel. Stay close. They slipped through the back of the warehouse. The three of them moved quickly through the darkness. Branches scratched against Elvis's jacket as they crossed the field. Behind them, voices echoed from the warehouse. Someone had discovered that they were gone. Samuel was breathing heavily. Elvis slowed down. You okay? Samuel nodded. I'm scared. So am I. The boy looked surprised. You are? Elvis smiled faintly. Being scared doesn't mean you stop. They continued. A few minutes later, they saw a small cabin near the river. There was a light inside. Elvis approached the window. He looked through. A man was sitting on the floor. His hands were tied. Samuel gasped. Dad! Elvis pushed open the door. The man looked up. "Samuel?" The boy ran into his father's arms. For a moment, nobody spoke. The father held his son tightly. Then he looked at Elvis. "Who are you?" Elvis smiled. "Just somebody who heard your son needed help." The man looked toward Carter. Then he understood. "How did you find me?" Samuel answered proudly. "He helped me." His father looked at Elvis again. There were tears in his eyes. "Thank you." Elvis shook his head. "Thank your son." Suddenly, headlights appeared through the trees. Carter looked outside. "They found us!" Everyone froze. The father stood. "We have to go." Elvis helped him toward the back door. They hurried toward the river. Behind them, voices shouted. Then came the sound of footsteps. Samuel began crying. Elvis knelt beside him. "Samuel, look at me." The boy looked up. "Remember what you told me?" "What?" "You said I shouldn't be afraid to sing." Samuel nodded. Elvis smiled. "Then don't be afraid now." They reached the road just as another vehicle appeared. For a terrifying moment, Elvis thought they were trapped. Then headlights appeared from the opposite direction. It was the sheriff's car. Someone had finally reported what was happening. The men chasing them stopped. The sheriff stepped out. Within minutes, the situation was under control. Samuel's father was safe. The evidence from the warehouse was recovered, and the people responsible for the theft were eventually arrested. But Elvis barely paid attention to any of it. He was watching Samuel. The boy was sitting beside his father, exhausted, but smiling. Elvis walked over. Samuel looked up. "You came back." Elvis smiled. "I promised." Samuel reached into his pocket. He pulled out another tiny piece of paper. Elvis laughed. "Another note?" Samuel nodded. Elvis opened it. There were only 5 words. "Don't forget to come back." Elvis looked at him. "I won't." Samuel smiled. Then he hugged him. Elvis froze for a second. Then he gently hugged the boy back. It was a simple moment. No cameras, no audience, no applause. Nobody knew about it. But Elvis would remember it. Before leaving, he walked back toward the church with Samuel and his father. The pastor was waiting outside. He looked at Elvis, then at Samuel. "You found him." Elvis nodded. "We did." The pastor smiled. "Not bad for a man who only came here to listen to a song." Everyone laughed softly. Elvis looked toward the church. The same wooden building, the same windows, the same piano. But Elvis wasn't the same young man who had walked through that door days earlier. He reached into his jacket and touched Samuel's first note. "You shouldn't forget why you sing." The pastor noticed. "You kept it." Elvis nodded. "I think I need it." The pastor smiled. "You probably will." Elvis looked at Samuel. The boy waved. Elvis walked toward his car. Before getting inside, he stopped. He looked back at the church one last time. Then he smiled. Years later, when Elvis's voice had become known across America, the world would hear him sing thousands of songs. People would talk about his stage presence, his clothes, his movements, his records, his fame. But there was one rainy night in 1955 that nobody knew about. A night when a 20-year-old Elvis Presley walked into a small black church as a complete stranger. A night when an 8-year-old boy saw past the young singer's appearance and recognized something deeper. He recognized loneliness. He recognized longing. And most importantly, he reminded Elvis that a voice wasn't valuable because thousands of people heard it. A voice was valuable because sometimes one person needed to hear it. And before we close, tell me something. If you were Samuel, would you have trusted Elvis that night? Comment yes if you would. And tell us where you're watching from, your city or country. If this story touched you, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and share it with someone who loves emotional stories. Because sometimes the people who change our lives don't give us money, fame, or success. Sometimes they simply remind us who we are. And sometimes the smallest voice in the room can teach the biggest lesson. For Elvis, that lesson came from an 8-year-old boy, and he carried it with him long after he drove away from that little wooden church. Don't forget why you sing.